We're live again on American Zarathustra. Thank you so much for joining us for another wonderful episode of Afternoon at the Museum. Today, I'm very, very pleased to have two friends, two astute members of the white political sphere. We have Tyler Hamilton. How are you today, sir?
I am doing pretty well. Just excited to talk about art, which should be fun because commenting on various pieces of art is well outside my purview of specialty. So it'll also be very much a learning experience for me. It'd be like going to a museum and just enjoying what I see and saying what comes off the top of my head. But it should be a learning experience for sure.
It's a really nice, cozy stream. People are really enjoying it a lot. And also, let me just quickly introduce my guest and good friend Nullus. How are you today, bud?
I'm doing all right. And hello to Tyler, hello Donald, and hello to the audience. This is going to be very interesting. I'm also far from an expert in art, so this is going to be as much of a discovery as it is going to be, hopefully, a fun conversation.
Cool. So the theme of the show is Catholic art, and the two wonderful, intelligent hosts or guests that I have here today are people that are very, very knowledgeable about Catholicism, and two people that I've turned to, or that I should say I look up to in that regard. Catholic art within the history of Europe and just white culture in general is enormous. I should say Christian art in general. So I feel that it's a really, really big topic, and certainly far greater than what we could cover in an hour. The Afternoon at the Museum shows are generally a casual show, and then through our just general enjoyment of art, a lot of kind of magical conversation just spins out of that, just naturally, organically. So I think we've got two really, really intelligent and sincere people to talk about Catholicism and how it relates to the art. I obviously always lead as far as art-related discussions. So what we'll do first here is I wanted to kind of chat a little bit and say, I grew up Catholic, and the artwork in the church that I grew up in was exquisite, beautiful, absolutely stunning and rich. And I think anyone who grew up Catholic is familiar with these kind of very, very beautiful, ornate environments that we practice the faith in. And for me specifically, though, I think partly because I'm naturally an artist, I'm a visual learner, the impact of the art on me in my spiritual process and in the way that I understood my experience of Catholicism was really, really profound, like immeasurably profound. We look at Catholic art, and it's very narrative. It's not something that we're exploring the frontiers of what painting can be, like abstract art, for example, or something like that, or cubism, or what have you. It's very much about the storytelling. However, Christian art, in a way, is really the map of the progress of art in Europe. Since I don't know, at least maybe the first, second century. If you go back to the Gothic period and you look at the simple churches, you look at the simple paintings, they're very flat. This kind of artwork is associated very much with Byzantine art, with Orthodox Christianity. And then somewhere around the 12th, 13th, 14th century, you start to see perspective drawing coming in to the technology of art, if you will. And then, you've had the Renaissance, you have realism, you start to go even farther into romanticism and such. So it's an excellent kind of a path on which we can look at the development of art in Europe, let's just say. So that's a pretty nice frame to look at it for starters. But my personal question to both of you is, what are your thoughts on how Christian art, Catholic art, plays a role in the practice of Catholicism and in the spiritual technology of Christianity? And I'll start with Tyler.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually a very central question when it comes to Catholic theology, primarily because the role of art extends long past, for example, finding a piece of painting in a museum or in your own private prayer altar. In fact, art plays a pretty central role in the liturgy if we're talking about in the wider sense of art when it comes to aesthetic. And the reason for that, and the reason that Christian, specifically Catholic art, and you can also say this for the Orthodox as well, has a very unique touch to it that seems to be pointing beyond the image itself, is because a big notion within Catholic theology is the idea that the three transcendentals, as we call them, the good, the true, and the beautiful, are all united in one and have their origin in God, in which the highest expression of all three mingles with each other. And so this goes back to the theological view of what we actually understand by when we mean the good, right? So good is simply found within God. There's no separation between God and good. It's the highest form of possible good, while something like evil is actually privation. So this is a common misunderstanding, is we tend to think about evil as an opposing force, as if there's like another metaphysical principle called evil in conflict with God in a very dualistic sense, which is something we find among the various early Gnostic sects, for example. They tend to think about this kind of opposing force dualism. So the question is, how does this play into art if we understand that privation, which simply means negation? In other words, to turn away from the good is to turn towards nothingness. It's to turn away from your origin. It's to turn away from your created end. So what this is a privation of the good, and the good, the true, and the beautiful. If something is true, it is also beautiful, and it's also good. If something's good, it's also beautiful and true, and so on and so forth. So the importance of this, when it comes to the three transcendentals, is that what happens in modernity is that these things become separate from each other. So, for example, political power becomes separate from truth, and also becomes separate from beauty. Beauty becomes something like a purely abstract aesthetic that you could, for example, put into a museum as somewhere that you would just go, right? And it becomes formal and instrumentalized in life. It becomes wielded according to a rational instrumentality, and it becomes something essentially in its own independent sphere. And so to bring this phenomenon to clarity, and there you can also see, for example, in various aristocratic upper class life, there's a certain amount of prestige that comes with owning certain paintings and understanding classical music and the like. But it has a very dwindling, almost dimming candle in a dark room feel to it, kind of like a dead text, because it's taken outside of its context of also being good and true at the same time as it is beautiful. So what we understand then by the three transcendentals is that these three things are supposed to be interlocked in the kind of community that we form, which we find expressed in the liturgy, and we also find it expressed in iconography. So essentially, the main focus of Catholic art, generally speaking, in its theological purpose, is that it is supposed to point to something outside of the frame. And in fact, you find this quite often in images of saints and iconography. They're looking outside the frame, and people think, oh, maybe it just means they're looking up towards God, which is true to an extent. But what it actually means, which is what the difference between an idol and an icon is an idol is something that merely points to itself. It holds the gaze, and you effectively become mystified by the image itself. But the reason a lot of Catholic iconography has this excess of meaning and saturation is because it points to something outside the frame. And the purpose of that is that it shows that the lives of the saints and the like is a life and a beauty that they achieved solely by being glorified by God. And so you are meant to point towards something greater than your imminent field of vision. And this is not separable from ecclesial church life. It's not separable from liturgy. It's not separable from the call to God to live a glorious life. And so one of the issues that comes with examining various amounts of Catholic art today is we tend to think of it in the sense of aesthetic genius. We think of it in a modernist sense. We think of it as an individual producing beautiful art, which is true to an extent, but it only makes sense in that context of communal Christian church life, which is meant to show an excess of meaning, a certain transcendence that gives it the quality it has. It gives it that timeless beauty, because it points to a form of life which is not separable from the other spheres of the true and the good, but rather they're meant to be mingled together in the formation of a community which is ultimately aimed towards glorifying God in their life. And so this is how I would say the theological purpose of Catholic art plays itself out. And there's quite a bit more I could say on a phenomenological level, but I think that will suffice for now.
Yeah, I want to quickly also ask you if you could do just a kind of a quick review of some of the discussions you've been having on your own channel recently. We spoke a little bit about that before going live. If you can maybe just let people know about your channel and some of the topics you're covering that obviously relates to this.
Yeah, well, I mean, when it comes to my channel in general, there's EBL, which I think most of the audience would probably be familiar with, because that's what gave me my start, so to speak, is which got us a following, was EBL.
Mm-hmm.
In case anyone's not familiar with that, that's the show where right now the lineup is me, Joel, and Geo, and also Josh is coming back soon, and Jefferson as well.
Oh,
but right now it's just me, Joel, and Geo. And originally, before, it was me, Josh, and Jefferson, and before that, there's another crew, which was more like a revolving door, essentially, of basically just a group of guys getting together to discuss philosophy. But what we would do is take a different text in the history of philosophy and break it down for the audience and discuss its relevance for today, but also subject it to some critique. So, for example, the most recent episode we did was on the French Marxist structuralist Louis Althusser, and we subjected him to an imminent critique using his own logic. So we pointed out where he was right and where he imploded Marx from within, but then also he failed to go beyond dialectical materialism to a conclusion which I think would actually be truly radical and more in line with the kind of critiques we would make. So but we also go back to the pre-modern. We go all throughout the history of philosophy, actually. So if that's your thing, you might like EBL. But the main show we have is Theopolitics, which is essentially a 3-tiered program. So the first aspect of that is political theology, in a sense the audience might be familiar with if they're familiar with Carl Schmitt, which is to show the parapolitical origins of modern politics in earlier theological sources. The second aspect of that is to actually critique largely the tradition of political theology, including that of Schmitt, to something a lot more radical, you could say. And the way we go about achieving this is, for example, we're taking the audience through John Milbank's work, Theology and Social Theory, though we do videos just on our own without reading, but it's a very helpful book to help the audience understand this. And we set out to show how the origins of modernity and secularism, because the problem is also liberalism. It's secularism, not just liberalism. And show how the origins of all modern thought, including subjects like political science, economics, sociology, are ultimately disciplines that contain their own metaphysical and foundationalist assumptions, which go back to heterodox theology and neo-pagan agonistics. So while they pretend to be secular, like you find in sociological discourse and the like, in fact, what they actually do is police the borders around the modernist foundation and actually solidify it. And in many ways, these kinds of presumptions work the way even into these kind of spheres when you get into like taking influence from people like Joseph de Maistre, for example, who we actually subjected to a very heavy critique.
What's Maistre known for? What, if you just, for the audience, I could tell about him.
Yeah, he's one of the French Catholic reactionaries who reacted against the French Revolution, and argued for the importance of the papacy and monarchy and the like. But we subjected him to a critique because ultimately we exposed him as a mystical materialist and a Freemason who collapses natural theology and revealed theology together, so that there's this ineffable phenomenon called the social, which is where the ideas of God are revealed through. So he picks up the ideas from Malebranche, and also de Bonald does this as well, where the ideas of God is how the subject comes to comprehend the world, except they take that and they say, rather, it's the ideas of God are revealed in the social and revealed through institutions. So he collapses transcendence of God into an immanent realm called the social, which is somehow ineffable. And that's meant to be the bridge that connects the individual and society, which is the problem that comes with the earlier instantations of liberalism, when they set up the idea that the problem is how to resolve individual wills and sovereignty. And so this notion of the ineffable social phenomenon is actually not anti-enlightenment or pre-enlightenment, but it's actually post, or you could say hyper-enlightenment, which is what you find in the French Catholic reactionaries. And then what you get with sociology, and Milbank's work goes very heavy into this, is that they take de Maistre and de Bonnell's idea of the social, and they say, okay, well, now we don't need to keep the ideas of God part. We could simply understand the whole history of civilization as leading up to the Western model, which is that we understand there's a pre-modern tribal sense of the sacred, which is imbued in everyday life, and then that becomes supplanted by doctrine, which then localizes into proper spheres where the theological ideas truly belong. And then that moves into deism. And then finally we get to Auguste Comte, is like, okay, well, we have this ineffable social, but really the phenomenon here is the social itself. So he takes this idea from de Maistre and then says, okay, well, now we understand that there's this thing called the social, and we can therefore effectively police the borders, and we can come to self-understanding of who we are, and we don't need those doctrinal ideas anymore. So what you find in the French Catholic reactionaries gets taken over and also combined with neo-Kantianism in, for example, Durkheim or the work of Simmel. And that is where you get a lot of the debates in social science now, and even in reactionary spheres, when we start talking about things like power analysis, like power does this or power does that, or a monarchy will need a monotheism, and then monotheism will need a monarchy. Like, it starts describing ideal types of the social, and those ideal types are tied back to some Kantian notions of the a priori. And so when we subject those to a kind of critique where we expose the origins of them, we're exploring the contingencies and unearthing them, the contingencies of modernist life, which pretends to be secular, but nonetheless is not. It is founded on a particular theological and very much a heterodox and also a pagan one. And so in doing that, we're exposing the contingency at the heart of secularism and liberalism, and then proposing an alternative, which would be, of course, Augustinian. Now, my co-host on Theopolitics, Doris, is actually Eastern Orthodox, so we have a bit of contention there, which is kind of fun.
Interesting.
At times. On episodes I'm not on, he does slam the papacy, which was only one episode so far. So luckily, Catholic fans didn't get too upset over that. But so the third pillar of theopolitics then is to explain what a theological politics is, because if we accept that understanding that all these discourses, political science, economics, sociology, are ultimately contingent discourses that contain so many presumptions about them, we can therefore argue for the legitimacy of theology as a grand meta-narrative, which will actually, all the others need to become subservient to it. And so that's essentially the theopolitical gestures, to think politics going forward in a truly radical way, because if your politics is simply political philosophy and no theology, then it's going to be insufficiently radically political. So that's the main slogan, you could say, of theopolitics. And then, so if the audience is interested in that, they can check it out. There's members-only episodes as well. We've done things on, for example, the myth of religious violence, the idea that religion causes wars, that there's something called the wars of religion. And we expose that myth and what those wars were actually about. So it's partly historical, partly theological, partly philosophical, and all red pills, you could say. But also from that, where we are now is because we found a phenomenon where we've made a heck of a lot of converts in the distant right through this show.
Wild. That's wild.
And almost like every week I get a message from somebody, which is very encouraging. But at the same time, what is also popular in the distant right is the resurgence of various sensationalist literature about the historical Jesus, which, again, it's sensationalist literature. There's nothing scholarly about it. But I am finding I'm getting a lot of questions, for example, about Christ myth theory, like the idea that, the Jesus story is composed of earlier legends. I'm getting a lot of stuff about, early Christianity was diverse, right? There was no orthodox sect. It was rather something that was imposed later on in the 4th century. You find the ideas like Paul invented Christianity either wholesale or that he just diverged entirely from the teachings of Jesus. And so we started a series. Well, not we. This is me doing this myself because I have a background in biblical history. Is essentially an apologetics series. So we started with, I just recorded now, it's not up yet, on a history of Christ myth theory, going through all the major works in it and showing how none of them are actually very scholarly. They're actually, for the most part, pretty hilarious if you read the books. But we'll be moving to more serious topics as well. So we'll be refuting the Christ myth theory, and then we'll be answering questions on, for example, how do we get the biblical canon? How do we know the historical reliability of the Gospels? What do we know about extra biblical sources about Jesus as well as early church life? What kind of textual variants do we have in the various manuscripts of the Gospels? These kinds of things. The questions about essentially historical reliability of Christian claims. So we're going heavily into the field of biblical scholarship, biblical history, and the like to clear the path, so to speak.
Okay, wow.
Which is going to be pretty fun.
That's intense work, and you are very well cut out for that. I mean, you've got the brain muscle to move those rocks, and like you say, clear the land or clear the path. That's tremendous work that you'll be doing. I'm sure that it's going to, really, how do I say, maybe be controversial for various people, because there's quite a lot of different ideas in the idea marketplace of the dissident right and people that are real passionate about stuff. But I haven't seen anyone yet come forward to do what you're doing, and I think it's astonishing. So it'll be very, very interesting. I also really would like to try to get your link in the chat, the public chat. Maybe you can. We'll definitely put the link with the show. I want to pass the mic to Nullus to see if he'd like to respond to anything that Tyler said before we go.
Well, the only thing I would add, I mean, it's really perfectly summarized, especially theologically. Maybe historically, one could make the argument that the early Christian art was a direct continuity of Roman art in many ways, in its style, in its presentation, in its use of various media back then. So the Roman culture had a very strong influence on early Christian art, and that transcended then into the various different schools then later on in the Middle Ages and then in the Renaissance and so on and so forth. So I think that this is an important point to mention, maybe in the understanding of the continuity of the European man in this context, to understand that Christianity is a European religion. It's a European culture. It has that element to it that's very important for everyone to know. And that's very strongly represented by its artistic expression, whether that's in music or whether it's in paintings, frescoes, or statues, or what have you. Maybe another thing I would add to this only is that there's an element here, of course, for the average, for the laity, right? When they go into a church, all of these scenes around them creates a metaphysical reality for the laity. It gives them an understanding that this is a very real understanding of God's divinity, of reaching out to God, of the glorification of God. So there's an element here that when you step into the church, when you celebrate Mass, and you're surrounded by images, statues of saints, of various, let's say, depictions of New Testament depictions, or what have you, whatever it is, or of a saint, or what have you, then what you're really doing in there, as you're incorporating that into your entirety in the entirety of the celebration of Mass. So you're bringing it all in, and you're also expressing that outward to the glorification of God. So I think that for the average person, that gives them a better understanding, a better connection to this metaphysical reality. And I think that's pretty much, a good way to start.
That was beautifully stated. And it actually speaks to my question about how does art function as a spiritual technology. And so what we're realizing obviously here is that there's many layers to this topic. And as I said in the beginning of the show, an hour is not enough. I mean, we're 26 minutes in, and it's like that was just the intro, So it's like so profound.
Well, you see, I'm trying to stall with speaking as much as possible.
So you're going to have to talk about art.
I know nothing about art.
Well, dude, you're in good hands, my man. You're in good hands. I mean, honestly, it almost feels like we should do a whole show just on this and like really go deep. That could actually be pretty awesome. Let me kind of step back for a second, and I'll kind of take the podium a little bit here. So earlier we were talking about the development of art. So let's just think about music, for example. Okay, how do you compose a piece? How do you build an instrument? How do you organize a number of musicians? How do you write it down so that people can read the music? There's all this kind of cultural development in the arts in the West, in European man. And it's profound. It's a beautiful thing. And that's what this show is about, is reconnecting us to our greatness. And so this one image, I mean, there's a billion images we could look at, but this one right here, it kind of consolidates a number of different things. So for starters here, space and time are elements here. So I would say that, there's different narrative times in the Bible, say, where Mary is she becomes pregnant with Jesus, and then she tells somebody in another. So here we have like two times in the same space. But this is a very interesting narrative device where we're looking at the divine conception, but yet we're seeing two different times in that space. It's an interesting aspect here. Here, looking at the physical space of the room that she's in, this is what we call forced perspective. So at when the time of this painting came out, this would have been the cool new thing. This would have been really exciting, that not everything is flat anymore, but it has this illusion of space, illusion of reality. And artists, they would use devices like these tiles on the floor or various aspects of the architecture to kind of demonstrate, or almost show off the skill of forced perspective. So with perspective, what you have is an imaginary horizon line, and then you'll have a vanishing point on the horizon line, and all of these edges, all of these lines will point to that vanishing point. So if I was able to, say, put a ruler over this, I could put the ruler in one point and then tilt it or swivel it along all of these lines here to show how that illusion of space is created. Now, what's funky about it, though, is that this space back here has a different vanishing point. And so in a sense, it's breaking the rules of space. And so that's not going to work. But it's, again, this is the evolution of the arts and the technology of visual arts in Europe at this time. So I think all of these are interesting things. There's another really interesting element here where, if you see this angel, it has a kind of like some sort of cloth that, it's got some text on it. And so that text, in a sense, is almost as if it's kind of like in comics, you would have a word balloon. And it's like a method of showing the angel speaking. So it's kind of beautiful in its own right. Again, up here we have, I'm assuming this is God, blowing some kind of divine wind through here. We have all these kind of angel wings around God the Father, and there's just so many interesting devices. But then you ask, well, why is, what's this mountain back here? What's that for? Why are we showing this architecture? What's that for? So again, and you have a castle way up in the corner here. All of these things, I think they show the different levels of skill of the craft of painting for that time. So that's something that adds to the whole overall value and realism for its time. So all of these things come together. And again, I mean, this painting, I believe, is in the 14th century. So, we've evolved, I guess, quite a lot since then in terms of like what we can do in the arts. But it's a pretty nice look at the skills that we've developed over time. So that's just something I wanted to add to that conversation that we're having, is to kind of look at the technology of painting, if you will. Now, let's jump way ahead in time, and we're going to look at some work that Nullus has asked me to share. And so I'm going to put that up on screen. While I do that, Nullus, if you could do a little preparation, sort of tell the audience about the work, the artist.
Sure. So the artist's name is Mihai Munkácsy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is it's not he wasn't born with this name. His name was Mihai Leo Lieb. Now, his father was a bureaucrat, apparently of Bavarian origin, and his mother was a Hungarian noblewoman. And they lived in the city of Munkácsy, Hungary, which was a part of the Hungarian kingdom at the time. And now it's a part of the Ukraine. And Munkácsy, that's how he used that name, Munkácsy, meaning from the town of Munkácsy. And he was born Catholic, raised Catholic. His family on both sides were all Catholics. And so he was very much steeped in that tradition. This trilogy that that I mentioned was commissioned by an Austrian art dealer called Sedlmayr, who asked him to create this Christ trilogy. And these are humongous paintings. These are basically Christ in front of Pilate is the one. The second is Golgotha. And then the third is Ecce Homo, right? Those are the three themes for each painting. And what's really interesting here is that over the course, and it was commissioned, I believe, toward the end of the 19th century, I think somewhere around 1890s, 1880s. I think it was in the early 1880s. So he painted the first Christ in front of Pilate in 1882. He painted Golgotha in 1884 and Ecce Homo in 1896. And what's very interesting is that these three paintings separated over the following century and wound up in different parts of the world. There was one painting was in Canada. I don't know how it got there. It was another painting wound up in the hands of a Hungarian art collector who lived in the United States and his private collection. And so he bought it from, I think, the descendants of one of I don't know if it was Sedlmayr or one of his partners that their descendants owned one of the paintings and then brought it out to the United States. And then one of them was donated by Déri, which is he was an art dealer in Hungary who donated to the museum in Debrecen in Hungary. And so that's where, over time, to make a long story short, the Hungarian government managed to get all three of these paintings back to Hungary. So now it's owned by the Hungarian government. It's in this Déri museum in Debrecen in Hungary. And you can go to this museum and see these three paintings alongside each other, which was a very big deal. And the Hungarian, it was in Hungary, it was a huge deal. It was all over the press that these three paintings were finally back together again where they belong. And so that's why I thought it would be interesting, beyond the fact, of course, that these are very clearly explicit Christian themes. Yeah.
So context here, the paintings are like, I don't know, maybe 12 to 15 feet tall. Right. So if you can envision the scale of these things, I'd say every person in the painting is probably a real life scale, to scale to real life. I want to tie all this back into everything that Tyler was talking about, the three transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. So, our ability as a people to create beauty through visual art, specifically, and for this show, it has sort of grown, evolved, developed, progressed over time. And so looking at what we were just looking at earlier and then comparing it to this is a giant leap forward. And I want to also quickly say, I have how do I say this? Someone who goes through art education in America, for example, we almost only look at, I would say pretty much we only look at Western European art. And there's this massive gap of understanding of like the history of Central and Eastern European art. And, the more that I get a chance to look at works like this, which is Hungarian in this case, it just shows me like there's this tremendous continuity between the East and the West in Europe, but that because of our education somehow or other, we're cut off from that. And I kind of wonder, does that have something to do with, like World War II and communism and the Iron Curtain? Or why is it that in America, we don't learn about artists in Poland and Romania and Hungary and Russia and these other kinds of places. That's kind of a separate question. I don't know if either of you have any insights to that.
I don't really think I have a particular insight to it, but I think that it's just a question of emphasis. So in the United States, it's more focused on the Anglosphere, Germany, France. These were very, very strong influences generally, and that always takes a back seat to not just Central and Eastern Europe, but also Scandinavian artists aren't really well represented either, I think, as much as they should.
No,
maybe Italians, obviously, so these are very prominent. And I would encourage everyone to explore all of these other parts of Europe when it comes to visual arts.
Excellent point. So in a piece like this, let's respond a little bit to this here. Comparing the two works of art that we just looked at, which one do you respond to more, just on a kind of like a feeling level?
Do you mean between the one of Gabriel and Mary, or between Pilate and
the piece from the 13th century that we were looking at before? That's
okay.
Yeah, the first piece that I showed.
Well, I mean, I personally respond to them. Well, I mean, I do have more of an attachment to the later ones you're presenting here, because when we pray the rosary, these would be called the sorrowful mysteries. What's being depicted here now, theologically, there's a lot of importance to these images, actually, and it goes a long way to understand why the Jews actually pushed for Christ's crucifixion. And you can't understand that unless you understand Temple Judaism and the revolutionary zeal of both the Pharisees and the Sadducees at the time, although those two groups actually had divergencies as well. Pharisees were essentially thought of as lower class than the Sadducees. But the Pharisaic belief was that the idea of bodily resurrection was tied to the restoration of Israel, in the sense that it would become an imminent overthrowing of Roman authority. And this would be the promised end of the covenant of God to Israel, that Israel would become a restored and glorified nation. And then the Sadducees, on the other hand, actually fully denied bodily resurrection. For them, fulfillment of the covenant was essentially that God would establish that the Messiah would come and would overthrow Rome and rule on their behalf, basically. And so the scandal of Christ, when he willingly goes, and you can find that depiction in the other image when he's standing before Pilate, is that he willingly accepts his fate, that he is to die for the whole of humanity. And so this scandal is a part of the fact that to them, this was a denial of the revolutionary zeal of early Temple Judaism. And this was something that they didn't anticipate, because they expected a violent overthrow which would rule on behalf of their own Jewish interests, rather than the kind of resurrection story we have, where it gets to the heart of the theological question of the kingdom of God is always here, but also it's to come. And that we also find right after this event, if we take a look at the early historical sources, a community willing to die for it, seemingly out of nowhere, with a belief that was completely unanticipated within Temple Judaism and everything we know about the Jewish communities in that context. So theologically, it's very important that Christ goes and accepts his fate. And this is actually one of the most important tenets of understanding Christian theology. But when it comes to the other one, though, so I have more of an attachment to this image, but depictions of our Blessed Mother do mean quite a lot to me. And part of that is because she is the foundation of the church, in the sense that at the very beginning, when Gabriel appears to her, she declares that she is the Lord's servant and she will obey. And she also later on, when Jesus grows up, and she tells the others, listen to what he says. She always says, I do. She is the Blessed Mother who comes to stand for the church, which always says yes to the call to suffer in for the name of the Lord. And so to me, that is one of the most important tenets. And you find this within iconography about the Blessed Mother, is that she always has this almost somber look for the people of the world who are effectively suffering and in death and turning away from God. But she's always calling all sinners to repentance and all sinners to become saved to the soul. Right. So she is, in a way, the church, which is both there for the suffering of the world and to act to alleviate it, to call people and souls to salvation. So she acts as effectively the perfect model for how we are to behave. And so at least to me anyways, there's an equal importance to both of them, but the later art does speak to me more because I have more of a connection with art like this, at least in our recent past, than I do with the earlier forms of iconography. But it is interesting though, these kind of depictions of Mary, and they actually change. So like this one has that scroll on it, but you can also find others where Gabriel's carrying a flower, there's a bird in the background. The depictions change, but the theological message I think is given according to the different contexts.
There's something, I mean, this is obviously through a contemporary lens, but if we look at that very, very old art, the flatness of it, you can see that the artists are struggling with realism, and how do we depict realism? There's something otherworldly about it. Like, for example, the broken space and like having two events happen in the same space. I find that like it's sort of confusing in a way. It's surreal in a sense. And I feel like that could, for some people, actually be stronger because it's more interpretive. You see what I'm saying? Like it's I don't know how to phrase this properly, but I would say like for myself, looking at Christian art, growing up in the church, it was a window in a sense to both history and like a heavenly world. And so it tied together these three worlds of, me here now with, looking through the window of this history, and then even the divine and these kind of like, sort of graphic devices where you see, God blowing a golden thread down with, angels and the rest of it, the whole, all of that. I think for me, it actually works in an imaginative way, in a delightful and an imaginative way. Whereas realism, it's hard and definite and mathematical and uncompromising, and it's just raw, straight history. You know what I'm saying? So that's not to say it can't have the same impact. Obviously it can, but I'm kind of trying to say, I'm playing both sides of the coin here and saying like, which way is more powerful in terms of having an aesthetic and a spiritual experience? Do you want to respond to that, or should I?
Yeah, I'd like to interject actually, because I understand what you're saying is that there's, in the earlier kind of art that you show, there's a certain excess of meaning. And I mean, when I looked at that piece, I was wondering what the depiction on the right was supposed to be. And between the kind of mountainous, cavernous background, which seemed almost degraded and deteriorating, while in the first image you had this almost beautiful castle setting. And so I was very curious about what that was about. So it did draw me to a certain curiosity. The later one did not. But there is an interesting thing, though, about the realist depictions of Jesus. And you can even find this in like the blatantly realist depictions of Christ you'll find on the cross, for example, in certain kinds of art and churches. And one story that sticks out to me, I think it was Archbishop Fulton Sheen, I'll remember for sure. But basically, this when he was a kid, him and two other kids decided to play a prank on the priest by going to the confessional booth and making up a bunch of fake things to confess. And so they went to this priest, and the other two made up these fake sins. And then by the time the third kid got in, who I think was Fulton Sheen as a young man, the priest caught on to what was going on. And so after the confession was done, he said, okay, here's your penitence. Go up to that depiction of Jesus. So it's a very realist depiction of Jesus.
Yeah.
And he said, say to it 3 times, I don't care what you did for me.
Whoa.
He got to the second, and he couldn't go on anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that there's, with these later images you're showing, there's not so much a mystical curiosity about them that I find in the 13th century one, which has an excessive iconographic effect. But I do find in the realist depiction the very, you could say, immanent sense and material sense of Christianity, which is the idea that Christ is historical, that God is a man in history who willingly suffered on behalf of you. And I think that that depiction does draw us, like depictions like this, it draws us into an understanding of that divine self-emptying love for the whole humanity, which is hard to deny because it's flesh and blood. It's not an abstract religious doctrine. It's a doctrine of a man who suffered and dies in the world, which is someone who is supposed to be there in all of our sufferings we go through now, which is a part of the main message of Christianity, in contrast to the depiction that critics usually make, is that it's about an abstract heavenly beyond, which actually isn't true at all. And so I think it does go away in showing the uniqueness of that life and blood, real suffering, which is at the heart of the Gospels.
It seems to me that I'm learning something about myself, that maybe I respond more to, I guess, I'm being very clumsy tonight, but kind of the idea of Christ rather than the man, where the Christ spirit, or what it is to be a Christ, or what is the process of salvation, and ideas rather than history, if you will. Because again, I'm searching for the spiritual technology of Christianity and how it can help me.
Donald, if I can interject, I think you hit the nail on its head with that comment. I think that the 13th century painting is exploring that exact theme of understanding the idea of Christ. It's showing, at least the way I saw that image, that you have the sophisticated urban civilization on the left, and then you have sort of the wild countryside on the right. And again, I'm not sure if that was the intention of the artist, but that's how it transposed, and that's how it resonated with me. And I think that if I look at that image over there, they're talking about the idea of Christ. And then when you're looking at the more realistic depictions, if you look at this image here with the Christ with Pontius Pilate, Christ is looking up. He's not worried about all this babble that's going on around him. He's already beyond this, and he's accepted his fate as the innocent hero, if you will, who must make the ultimate sacrifice. So everything that's around him is now just noise, and it's almost like he's that one man. Maybe a good way to put it, he's that one man that stands in the crowd and just stands there, and his very presence commands a certain kind of understanding of who we are. And then I wanted to just go to the next point and say that when I look at the more realistic depictions of Christ and of any one of these religious paintings, the more realistic versions of them, in a way, I get the impression sometimes, especially if I go to church, that I'm looking at a spiritual mirror, so to speak. That everything that's in this picture, for example, there are elements of me in this picture. And there's there's the one who argues, there's the one who denies, there's the one who looks up to and glorifies God. There's so many different elements that I'm looking at, and then I look back, and then I'm looking at myself in a way through this image.
Yeah, there's one I'd like to add to what you guys are touching on, and that's on what Donald was saying about the certain ideas of spiritual technology that you're finding in the 13th century depiction. And one thing that does come to mind when I look at it is this idea, like that N.T. Wright would call, the theologian, he would call it the broken signpost. And when I look at that 13th century depiction, I see on the one hand, when the angel appears with this great message to Mary, which she accepts solemnly with an absolute obedience, is this understanding of coming triumph, coming glorification, the coming of the kingdom with this depiction of the castle. But on the right side, you have this broken, deteriorating landscape. And what I think that idea gets at is one of the central conflicts within Christianity, insofar as that paradox is a part of the spiritual technology, it's a part of the theology, is that within these broken signposts, basically the brokenness of the world, which is awaiting fulfillment in the second coming of Christ is this paradox between the flesh and the soul, which is always this kind of not a disembodied soul sense, but rather that the world is inundated with suffering and persecution and death and all manners of injustice. But nonetheless, there's a glorification at the heart of Christian life and the heart of eschatology, which through that brokenness and only through brokenness is triumph actually revealed, which goes back tied even to this depiction that you're showing right now and the passion and the sorrowful mysteries, is that within brokenness then comes at the end a salvific hope and an eschatological assurance of salvation. But the distinction between Christianity and other religions in this regard is it could only come about through the brokenness of the world and through the broken signposts. And so when I look at that 13th century depiction, now the more that I think about it, I don't think about so much of a conflict between the two, the kingdom on the left side and the coming and the expectation of the kingdom and the saying yes to it and the brokenness on the right, but rather the kingdom which moves within the suffering of the world, which is always here, but the kingdom is also yet to come, and there are glimmers of it. And I think that that's actually an important understanding of Christian spiritual technology.
Mm-hmm. It's a deep topic and something I struggle with every day, to be really honest. That's a very intimate reality. I'm always trying to understand how to be Christ-like, and in what ways do I do that? How do I do that? But I think understanding the world and kind of the spiritual lay of the land, what is the world and what is the soul? What is life? What are these things what is the struggle? If I don't understand the enemy or the war that I'm in, how can I fight it? And it seems to me like it's really from where I'm at now, my current understanding is it's a choice between love and fear. And, obviously God is love, and this kind of thinking is it's very simple, but it's actually not. Moment to moment and on very many levels of our identity and all of our interactions, there's this kind of question of, what do you choose, love or fear? And we're living in this kind of white genocide age where if we look at our enemies with love, we can see that they are objects of fear. They are born of fear. They are the manifestations of fear. And fear obviously leads to hatred and hatred and harmfulness and all the things that are going on. If you fear for the survival of your people, you're going to go to war with who you perceive as your enemy. And we are the enemy of the so-called chosen people. And so that, I think what I'm alluding to here, and the audience certainly does as well. So that I'm really tapping into the spinal column of the white identity sphere right here and saying, what is the truth? Who are we? Who are our enemies? And what is the path forward? How can we use our history, our religion, as a means to do that? And you both know that there's a lot of disagreement about those things. So I'm not kind of choosing a side, rather I'm posing the questions. And I love having both of you on, because I don't think there's enough people in representing your thinking, and people who are intelligent enough and sort of educated enough as well to be able to explain these things. They're not easy things to explain and talk about, but I think this is an excellent opportunity. And this is all off the cuff. I'm not, I'm just kind of looking for answers and trying to plug in what we're doing. Because what is art? I mean, it's a reflection of who we are, where we're going. It's not decoration. It's something much more profound. And it brings out these difficult questions. So I think,
if I could just add to that, Donald, just very quickly, and this is for the audience and also generally for myself as well. We have it all. We don't have to go to other sources to find answers. It's in our own traditions. It's in our own faith, and it's in our own understanding of Christ, our own understanding of how we understand ourselves in the world. It's all there. people tend to look at for New Age answers for everything, or they try to dig up things. We have to understand this as a continuity. We have to understand this as a part of our unique tradition. And once we understand that this is all, there's a synergy between all of these things, then it becomes a lot more logical in my view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something I want to attest to that you're getting at, Donald, and that's on the idea of love or fear. And I wager that more than people in these spheres actually realize, even if they might say, love our people and all that. But love is more than that. It's a part of actually how we know anything. And there's different ways of modeling knowledge. And you particularly find in the modernist world a very formal, rational, instrumental view of knowledge, where we pick things apart, we subject them to reductionist analysis, and then therefore we can control and instrumentalize them towards some kind of pragmatic end and purpose. And this kind of understanding of knowledge makes its way into the DR all the time. And when we talk about, for example, a lot of people will talk about like eugenic views on abortion, right? Things like essentially controlling or perfecting or creating the vote. And to me, this is so opposed to the way in which I understand how we actually love our people. And the reason for that is because, my understanding of knowledge is intimately bound up with love. And I don't mean that in a wishy-washy sense. I mean that in the sense that you can look at, for example, the fallen state of your people, which is not at all hard to observe. I mean, you have opioid crises. You have people who are checking out of family life because they have no hope. You have people, stuck losing themselves into video game addictions and all manners of depression and giving up on life. And in what way does subjecting any kind of instrumental view of who we are actually help lift them out of their state, or better yet, understand them? Not even at all. The fact of the matter is, the kind of notion of love we find in Christianity, in which we choose and we see a glorification of a people other than and more than the way in which they currently see themselves. In other words, you choose to see them as what they can be and what they were. In other words, who they really are.
Wow.
And the only way you can do that is if you choose to, and the only way you can know who your people are is if you have that view of love. Because looking in the present circumstances, if you take a reductionist material understanding, you simply won't end up with the kind of depiction of your people you want. Right? You'll find yourself quite bitter at them. Why aren't they waking up? Why aren't they turning away from drugs? Why aren't they having a family?
Right.
And I think the only thing that's going to help you actually see who they really are, is the view of love, which is ultimately who God created them to be, as a glorified particularity. In other words, we in the Catholic tradition, we don't think of things in terms of a universal humanity when it comes to the bodily sense. And this is something people mistake a lot, is everybody's created with a soul, everyone's created with the image of God, but nonetheless, resurrection and the eschatological vision is entirely bodily. You're created with that particular sense of uniqueness, which is also biological. But the only way you could see people as more than they are is if you choose to love them. But if you subject them to a material, reductionist, formal, instrumental rationale, you're never going to love them, and you're never going to win anybody over, because you're ultimately making people disposable, right? You're making them a means. And this is, I think, a problem for a lot of this discourse. And so I'd wager the only thing that's really going to save it is if you choose to love your people. But choosing to love them is just as much a way to true knowledge as it is an act that you do on their behalf.
There's a lot going on in my mind and in my heart right now, because we in our sphere, we're fighting for the survival of our race, and it's profound. We're brutalized day in and day out, and so to go into that fight with love, it's something that I don't see a lot of. There's just so much anger. We have love for each other, we have friendship, but then we have our infighting, our kind of family arguments, if you will, within the white sphere. But how do we look at our enemies in a way that is loving, but also in a way that will allow us to win, that will let us survive? And it's it's a profound thing, because I feel on the one hand, it's kind of like the, if you stare too long into the abyss stares back into you. If you don't go into this war with a loving heart, then you become the kind of the demons that you're fighting. They're like kind of evil can take over if you're driven by hatred and all these things. And so I really feel that you're honestly, our true identity is more our soul, where our bodies, this is just boot camp. We're we have to do something here in this life, in this time, that when we leave this earth, will obviously, we have a positive legacy, but that will evolve our souls, for lack of a better word. And love is that way. It's just so hard to have the nails driven into your hands and your feet, and to love the man with the hammer. There's some profound stuff, and it's very, very painful to feel this and like integrate it into the movement. But I think these are really profound questions that, I guess I'm providing these questions for the audience and let them contemplate it. Nullus, did you want to have any closing thoughts? We're going to wrap up the show.
No, I just wanted to thank everyone. I mean, this was a special privilege for me to discuss this kind of art and explore some themes related to Catholic art. And I hope that we were able to at least give an interest or have people take a second look at Catholic art and look at it for what it's intended to be, and hopefully you can walk away from it with a better understanding of what it means to be a Catholic.
And Tyler, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to respond to what you said, though, when it comes to love of enemies, because this is a topic which I think I'm really glad you're bringing it up, because it's a very underdeveloped one. And I think it points to a certain issue, which, by the way, I totally understand. It's very easy to get mad at our enemies. In fact, we should be mad at the way things are. I mean, there's no way anybody can look at the general abuse hurled our direction, which is having very real impact materially on real people, their livelihoods, their lives in some cases, right? Their sense of the future, the sense of hope is just being taken away, because effectively whites are scapegoated, right? It's the sacrificial goat that sort of justifies the neoliberal dream, the neoliberal globalist dream. And the main hindrance to that, at least in terms of the way the system justifies it, is essentially white people. So white people need to be scapegoated. And feeling rage at that is perfectly understandable. It's something that should be mad. I mean, Jesus got mad quite a bit at injustice. He threw the money lenders out of the temple with a whip. And so there is a place for anger, and that's entirely justified. But at the same time, there's a mindset I see adopted quite often, and I've had it in my replies too, some other horrific things I won't repeat. But it becomes a state of essentially playing along the same nihilistic compass, where it's an agonistic all against all view, where it's like there's no notion of a solution or a truly better world or anything which would actually point towards some kind of reconciliation. It's endless conflict, right? And the way this is presented is not even really a solution, right? You find this a lot among the Nietzschean types, is because the way the modern world operates is by this idea that there are various conflicting worlds, and the world is like various kinds of wills to power, people trying to make their claim, and we simply have to stake our own claim against the others. And one, that this is going to be deaf. It's going to fall on deaf ears, because that's already the morality of the world right now.
Yeah.
So it's simply not a solution. And then the other side of that is think about it in terms of what people say they want. So, for example, they say they want nationalism. They want their people to have their space where they could not only survive but thrive. At least that's the way I say it. Survive but thrive. I don't just want whites to survive. I want them to thrive.
Sure.
And when it comes down to it, then there's no way to have that conversation without having to talk about some kind of morality and also some kind of love. And the reason for that is because if you're trying to have like a global understanding of, nations, respecting nations or sovereignty and the like, or, why we should prioritize, the ethical flourishing over against the transhumanist abstract view of man, where we're essentially just consumers. You have to point to some kind of transcendent identity, because we inhabit a formal, rational, instrumental world, which sees these things merely as means to be controlled towards some designated purpose, which is something called progress, but never really goes anywhere. And so then what's the Catholic view in this regard? Well, when we talk about the kind of conflict that this global agenda is creating, it's one of agonism, right? And so the idea that we have, the ideal, is reconciliation without subsumation. So what it means is we become reconciled to each other as understanding that we are different communities created by God, and that we all have a destiny that's ordained by Him. But that needs to be understood in relation to others, in the sense that it provides, and there's a whole lot of theological stuff I can get into here, but I won't for the sake of time to justify it. But regardless, there's a sense of which you can derive a properly legal and political order when it comes on the global and domestic scales within Catholic social teaching, which is purposely orthodox, which would give us a moral and would give us a direction to envision the world along lines in which we would actually be able to respect the differences of each other without trying to subsummate them to some kind of global consumer model, which is what the main issue is. And in that sense, you can only do so with love, because you have to argue that there is a moral end in mind, a glorified end to what we're pursuing, rather than a state of agonism, which falls on deaf ears. And ultimately, and this is something people may not like to hear it, but if we won, but that kind of agonism, that kind of war of all against all, was the reigning ethos of said regime, I would be just as opposed to it as I am this one, because it creates all manners of injustice, and this kind of cycles go on and on and on. And I think, if anything, it's a regression from medieval Christendom. But I don't want to return to that. There's ways to articulate this and ways to move forward, and there's ways to go beyond that. So that's an argument for another day. But regardless, I think love is a category of knowledge which is indispensable. And when you try to think about these problems without invoking that, without understanding that, or trying to simply wave off any moral concern, you actually end up in more and more conundrums, which ultimately disservice the cause you're claiming to represent.
This is something I'd like to talk more about, definitely with you guys, specifically in this frame, the Christian frame, if you will. I feel like there's not enough discussion about this. I guess love being the tag term, but I mean, it's such a deep topic. How do we logistically use love to fight for our survival? It's a profound question. Well, I don't expect us to have the answer now, but go on.
Just with a quick line, and I'll because I know that we're running out of time, but love is will to power. That's the way we have to look at it.
It's a good twist there. I like that. It's very good. Let me quickly say to everyone in the audience, please do tune in to Conversations with the Wind. Nullus's poetry show this third season is starting off just fantastically. He had his show on White Art Collective D Live yesterday, Sunday, and then, of course, when's the next episode, Nullus? I think it's every other week.
The next episode is going to be on the 21st. As you were asking me, I'm looking at the calendar.
Yeah.
It's going to be on the 21st, November 21, at 8 p.m. on the White Art Collective D Live channel. But I'm also going to simulcast it on my YouTube channel.
Great.
If anyone wants to watch the archived season 1 and season 2 episodes of Conversation with the Wind, or yesterday's show, you can watch it on my YouTube channel, Abnormocracy, on YouTube. So that's where you can find all the old episodes, and even the one from yesterday.
Brilliant. Yeah, and Full Moon Ancestry will be on the next episode. That is correct.
Yep.
Really, really, really. We pre-record these episodes, so I can just tell everybody it's a must-see. So set that on your calendar. Well, I want to thank both of you so much for joining me today. Interestingly, we didn't get into like art critique and elements of design and all that kind of stuff, but that's totally not an issue. I really wanted to go this direction and talk about religion, philosophy, ethics. How does art work as a spiritual technology? So I'm very moved, very inspired, and I'm really going to carry this episode in my heart and contemplate a lot of the things that both of you said. I'm hoping that people in the audience also had some value from this time and do contemplate these issues. Please do leave comments, with the video, subscribe, like, share, the usual routine. And Tyler, where can people find you before we go?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Tyler Thammy. Back when I actually had a pretty big following as Thamster on there, I ended up getting banned one day for completely randomly, which I guess is unsurprising. But yeah, you can find me again at Tyler Thammy. I know I hear from people all the time that, hey, I didn't even know you were back. So if your audience is looking for me, that's where you can find my Twitter. Other than that, and most importantly, you could find me on YouTube at Thamster. And that's where all the EBL, theopolitics is, as well as individual videos. And I forgot to mention ECL, which is the film analysis show we do every now and then. Wonderful. And of course, the Gumroad, because theopolitics has a members-only episode where some of the more harder topics go there, as well as we simply just don't make everything public, just because we have a lot of episodes to make and gotta give the supporters something special.
Absolutely.
Gumroad, YouTube, and Twitter.
Beautiful. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with both of you. And thank you again to the audience for sharing this time with us. Please do share, get out and get involved in our movement. Be proud of who you are and let love reign. God bless. Have a good one.